One man killed 168 people in a single morning. Another gunned down 4 victims in a drug-fueled massacre. And yet another calmly ordered McDonald's before meeting the needle. These are Oklahoma's deadliest executed prisoners, and the shocking final moments you won't believe. Timothy McVeigh, the Oklahoma City bomber. At 9:02 a.m. on April 19, 1995, downtown Oklahoma City was ripped apart by a single deafening explosion. In an instant, 168 people were killed, including 19 children in a daycare center. The man behind it was Timothy McVeigh, a Gulf War veteran who turned his anger at the government into the deadliest act of domestic terrorism America had ever seen. McVeigh parked a Ryder truck filled with nearly 5,000 pounds of explosives outside the Alfred P. Murrah Federal Building, lit the fuse, and walked away. To him, it wasn't full of secretaries, veterans, or kids. It was a symbol. Minutes later, the bomb tore through 9 stories of concrete and glass, leaving survivors crawling through fire, smoke, and rubble. Investigators quickly followed the trail of destruction. A twisted piece of the truck's axle was traced to a Kansas rental shop. The clerk remembered the man who signed for it. Within 90 minutes of the bombing, McVeigh was already in custody, pulled over for driving without a license plate. A loaded pistol sat on his seat. He had been that close to escaping. His trial was a national spectacle. Survivors described the moment the blast hit, the desperate screams for help, and the silence where voices should have been. Families of the victims faced McVeigh as prosecutors revealed his chilling motive: revenge against the government for the siege at Waco and other grievances he had twisted into justification for mass murder. McVeigh showed little emotion, often appearing cold, even smug, as if his actions had been part of some larger mission. In 1997, a jury convicted him. 4 years later, on June 11, 2001, the sentence was carried out. McVeigh declined to speak, offering no apology, no last reflection. Instead, he left behind a written copy of the poem Invictus, ending with the words, "I am the master of my fate. I am the captain of my soul." His last meal was 2 pints of mint chocolate chip ice cream. At 7:14 a.m., he lay strapped to a gurney in Terre Haute, Indiana, as lethal injection flowed. Witnesses said he remained calm, eyes open, until the very end. For the families of 168 victims, justice came, though no execution could ever balance the scale of loss. Timothy McVeigh's name is burned into history as a reminder of how ideology, twisted into hate, can destroy innocent lives on a scale almost too vast to comprehend. But McVeigh wasn't the only figure in Oklahoma's death chamber whose crimes shook the nation. Up next, we meet a man whose rampage turned a drug-fueled feud into a massacre of 4 lives, his story ending just as chilling. Gilbert Postel, the Quadruple Killer, February 2nd, 2005. On the outskirts of Oklahoma City, a family feud was about to explode into something far deadlier. 22-year-old Gilbert Postel, fueled by meth and rage, grabbed an AK-47 and piled into a truck with his brother. Their target was a man they blamed for injuring their father in a motorcycle accident. But revenge didn't stop with one man. By the end of the day, 4 people were dead. The attack was fast, brutal, and merciless. Witnesses recalled the sound of rapid gunfire tearing through the air, neighbors diving for cover as Postel sprayed bullets without hesitation. 2 men were killed instantly. Another tried to run and was gunned down in the dirt. A 4th victim, a young woman, begged for her life but was executed in cold blood. It was a scene more like a battlefield than a quiet Oklahoma neighborhood. When police closed in, the evidence was overwhelming. Shell casings littered the ground. Survivors identified Postel, and he confessed, detached, almost casual, describing the massacre as though it were just another part of his life. Prosecutors painted him as reckless, violent, and driven by drugs. The jury didn't take long. He was sentenced to death for orchestrating one of the most senseless mass killings Oklahoma had ever seen. For nearly 17 years, Postel sat on death row. His appeals argued everything from brain damage to meth addiction, but the court stood firm. The crime had been too savage, the evidence too clear. Families of the victims waited through delay after delay, forced to relive the nightmare each time his name surfaced in the news. On February 17, 2022, the waiting ended. In the final hours, Postel was given his last meal, a McDonald's feast of 20 chicken nuggets, 3 large fries, 2 chicken sandwiches, a cola, and a caramel frappe. When asked if he wanted to make a final statement, he simply declined. No apology, no explanation, no words at all. At 10:14 a.m., witnesses watched as the lethal injection was administered. Postel lay silent, eyes closed, as the drugs took hold. Within minutes, he was gone. For the victims' families, there was no triumph in his silence, only a small measure of closure after years of grief. Gilbert Postel's story is a reminder of how quickly violence can spiral when hate and drugs take control. 4 lives were erased in seconds, and his own ended strapped to a gurney, wordless to the very last breath. But the chamber would not stay quiet for long. Soon after, another name echoed across Oklahoma's death row, a drifter who left bodies scattered across 3 states and whose final meal was as chillingly ordinary as his crimes were extraordinary. Stephen Ray Thacker, the multi-state killer. December 1999, in Bixby, Oklahoma, a young woman named Lacey Hill placed an ad in the newspaper to sell a pool table. She thought she was meeting a buyer that day. Instead, she opened the door to Stephen Ray Thacker, a drifter with charm on the surface, but darkness just beneath. What started as a simple transaction ended in terror. Thacker overpowered her, tied her up, and in a horrifying twist, took her life. It didn't stop there. With police closing in, Thacker fled across state lines. In Missouri, he crossed paths with a man named Ray Patterson. Thacker needed cash, and Patterson's ATM card became his target. Patterson fought back, and Thacker responded with fatal violence. Days later in Tennessee, Thacker struck again, killing a tow truck driver named David Lacey while trying to steal his vehicle. 3 states, 3 innocent lives. In less than 2 weeks, Thacker had carved a trail of death and fear across the heart of America. Investigators connected the dots quickly. Witnesses in all 3 states, ATM records, and forensic evidence tied the murders together. When Thacker was captured, he confessed with a chilling matter-of-fact tone. He admitted to each killing, acknowledging the devastation he had left behind. The trials were swift. Each state pursued its own case, each family forced to relive the nightmare in courtrooms hundreds of miles apart. The picture painted of Thacker was one of desperation, a man addicted to meth, fueled by theft and survival, who killed anyone who stood in his way. But prosecutors made it clear, addiction didn't excuse the cruelty, the binding of victims, the calculated nature of his spree. By 2002, Oklahoma had sentenced him to death for the murder of Lacey Hill. Missouri and Tennessee secured their own sentences. Thacker's name became synonymous with a multi-state killing spree that left small towns shaken and families shattered. For more than a decade, he fought his execution, but appeals ran out. On March 12, 2013, inside Oklahoma State Penitentiary, Thacker faced his final moments. His last meal was indulgent: a large meat lover's pizza, a small bag of peanut M&Ms, and an A&W root beer. When asked for final words, his tone was different from the cold confessions years earlier. He apologized, asking for forgiveness from the families whose lives he had destroyed. Witnesses said his voice trembled as he spoke, but nothing could undo the years of pain. At 6:10 p.m., the lethal injection began. Within minutes, Thacker was gone. For some families, his apology was too little, too late. For others, it was at least a sliver of acknowledgement after years of silence. Stephen Ray Thacker's spree showed how one man's choices could ripple across states, leaving devastation in his wake. His end came quietly, with words of regret, in sharp contrast to the chaos of his crimes. But Oklahoma's execution chamber had more stories to tell. Next was a man whose crimes were so bloody, so senseless, they turned a small-town bank into a scene of horror and left even seasoned investigators shaken. J. Wesley Neal, the Geronimo Bank Massacre, December 14, 1984. In the quiet town of Geronimo, Oklahoma, the First Bank of Chattanooga was starting a normal day. Customers walked in to cash checks, tellers counted bills, and the sound of small-town routine filled the air. Then J. Wesley Neal walked through the door, and in minutes that routine turned into a nightmare. Neal, just 20 years old, wasn't there for a simple robbery. He and his partner stormed the bank armed and ready. But when things didn't go as planned, Neal unleashed a level of violence that stunned even hardened investigators. He stabbed 3 employees and 2 customers, killing 4 of them on the spot. Survivors later described the attack as frenzied. Blood splattered across the walls. The quiet bank transformed into a scene of chaos and terror. The town of Geronimo was shaken to its core. This wasn't a big city crime. This was a massacre in a place where neighbors knew each other by name, where the bank was a fixture of everyday life. Families who had kissed their loved ones goodbye that morning were suddenly confronted with the unthinkable. Investigators pieced the case together quickly. Witnesses and evidence tied Neil to the killings, and when he was arrested, his lack of remorse chilled prosecutors. He boasted to others about the murders as though the lives he had stolen were nothing more than marks in a ledger. At trial, the jury listened to testimony from survivors, heard about the brutality of the stabbings, and saw photos of the blood-soaked bank floor. The weight of it was crushing. The verdict was death. For years, Neil's case wound its way through appeals, but the outcome never changed. The violence of the Geronimo Bank massacre was too horrific, the loss too deep for courts to reconsider. On December 12, 2002, nearly 18 years after the killings, Neil was led into Oklahoma's execution chamber. For his final meal, he chose a double cheeseburger, fries, peach cobbler, a pint of vanilla ice cream, and a large bottle of cran-grape juice. Witnesses said he ate calmly, almost casually, as though preparing for an ordinary evening instead of his final one. When asked for last words, Neil finally showed something different. Looking toward the families of his victims, he said, "I'm really sorry for what I did to you. I hope you find some comfort." Then, with a final prayer, the lethal injection began. At 6:18 p.m., he was pronounced dead. For the small town of Geronimo, closure came late. The wounds from that day never truly healed, but justice, in the state's eyes, had been carried out. Neil's name remains a reminder that even in the quietest corners, violence can erupt and leave scars that last for generations. And yet, Oklahoma's execution chamber would see another man whose crimes stretched beyond money or revenge, a killer who walked a darker path, and whose final words spoke of peace even as he faced eternity. Charles Troy Coleman, the contract killer. Charles Troy Coleman's life was a long trail of violence. By the time Oklahoma sentenced him to die, he had already been linked to at least 3 murders, some cold-blooded killings for money, others committed almost casually in the course of his drifting life. He was the kind of man whose name carried weight in prison, whispered by those who knew he could be as calculating as he was dangerous. One of Coleman's most infamous crimes was the execution-style killing of a Tulsa businessman, a murder for hire that exposed him as more than just a petty criminal. Prosecutors described him as a contract killer, someone willing to snuff out lives for cash with no hesitation and no remorse. For investigators, what stood out wasn't just the killings themselves, but Coleman's eerie calm. He moved between states, dodging suspicion, and when finally caught, he carried himself less like a desperate man and more like someone who believed violence was simply part of his job. His trial was grim. Witness after witness tied him to murders across Oklahoma and beyond. Families of victims filled the courtroom, listening as prosecutors described how Coleman orchestrated death for profit, leaving loved ones broken in his wake. The jury didn't take long. With his record of killings and his chilling indifference, death was the only sentence they saw fit. On September 10, 1990, Coleman was led into Oklahoma's execution chamber. Unlike many before him, he declined the ritual of a last meal. No steak, no sweets, no request for comfort food. It was as if he had already detached from the world, uninterested in final indulgences. When the time came for last words, though, he finally broke his silence. "Tell everybody I love them. I have peace and a quiet heart. Praise God." For a man long defined by blood and contracts, it was a statement that left witnesses puzzled. Was it a true moment of faith, or just the final mask of a man who had warned many? At 12:09 a.m., the injection flowed. Coleman's body went still. Outside the prison, families of his victims spoke of relief, though none mistook it for joy. Justice had been carried out, but the lives he ended could never be returned. Coleman's story remains a reminder of how violence for hire corrodes everything it touches. Families shattered, communities frightened, and lives traded like currency. His final words may have sought peace, but for many, the echo of his crimes left only questions. And while Coleman's killing stretched across years, the next story unfolded in a single night. One young man's crime of opportunity that ended in a pool of blood on a store floor, and a haunting message to the youth who would follow in his footsteps. Scott Dawn Carpenter, the store stabbing. He was just 22 when he walked into a small Oklahoma convenience store on a summer night in 1994. The plan was robbery, quick cash, and a fast escape. But within minutes, the floor was slick with blood, and the store's owner lay dying. The killer was Scott Dawn Carpenter, a young man whose choices had spiraled so far down that the path back no longer existed. Carpenter wasn't a hardened career criminal like some others on Oklahoma's death row. His crime wasn't a calculated contract killing or a mass attack. It was impulsive, desperate, and devastating. Prosecutors described how he pulled a knife during the holdup and in a burst of violence, stabbed the owner, someone just trying to make a living, working a late shift behind a counter. That single act turned a robbery into a murder and left a family without a father, a husband, a brother. The investigation was swift. Carpenter's face was familiar to locals, and eyewitnesses placed him at the scene. When arrested, he showed little understanding of the permanence of what he'd done. The trial exposed the senselessness of the crime, how a few stolen dollars had cost a life and destroyed his own future in the process. The jury took little time to convict him, and the judge pronounced the ultimate sentence, death. Carpenter spent the next 3 years on death row, writing letters and reflecting on his choices. In them, he didn't try to excuse what he'd done. He knew the evidence was clear. What haunted him most was how quickly his life had unraveled and how his decision had left so many people in pain. On May 8, 1997, Carpenter was led into the execution chamber at Oklahoma State Penitentiary. He had requested a last meal that was almost festive in its abundance: barbecued beef ribs, corn on the cob, baked beans, potato salad, hot rolls, sweetened lemonade, and pecan pie topped with whipped cream. For a brief moment, it was a taste of normalcy, though everyone knew it was his final one. When asked for last words, Carpenter turned his attention not to himself, but to others. His voice was steady as he said, "I tell the young and old, do not stray onto the wrong path in life as I did. It's a long and bumpy road with a lot of regret and few second chances." It was part warning, part confession, an acknowledgement that his short life had been wasted, and he hoped someone else might avoid the same fate. At 9:09 p.m., the drugs were administered. Within minutes, Carpenter was pronounced dead. For the victim's family, the execution closed a chapter that began with one terrible night in a corner store. For those who listened to his final words, it was a sobering reminder: one bad decision can end more than one life. But not every condemned prisoner left behind words of reflection. The next story takes us to a man who faced his final moments with chilling brevity, his last goodbye summed up in just 5 words. Richard Rojum Jr., the stepdaughter murderer. In June of 1984, a little girl named Layla Cummings vanished while staying with her mother in Elk City, Oklahoma. She was only 7 years old, bright, playful, and completely unaware of the danger that lurked just steps away. That danger was her stepfather, Richard Norman Rojum Jr. By the end of the night, Layla's life had been tragically stolen. Prosecutors described Rojum's crime as calculated and cruel. He abducted Layla, harmed her, and killed her before abandoning her body. The town was horrified. Elk City wasn't a place where parents feared for their children walking outside. The betrayal cut even deeper because the killer wasn't a stranger. It was someone trusted within the family circle. Police quickly turned suspicion toward Rojum. He was no stranger to law enforcement, and his behavior raised red flags almost immediately. Over time, evidence mounted and witnesses testified to his actions and confessions. The case that unfolded in court revealed a man without remorse, someone who saw Layla not as a child, but as a means to satisfy his twisted impulses. Jurors listened to every agonizing detail, and when it was over, they delivered the only sentence they believed could match the horror of the crime: death. For decades, Rojum's case wound through appeals. His attorneys argued mental illness, raised questions about trial procedures, and tried to push for new hearings. But each attempt failed. The evidence was overwhelming, and the cruelty of the crime left little room for doubt. For Layla's family, those long years of delays meant reopening wounds that had never healed. Finally, in 2024, 40 years after the murder, the execution date was set. On June 27th, witnesses gathered at Oklahoma State Penitentiary. Rojam's final meal was indulgent yet eerily ordinary. A Little Caesar's pizza with extra cheese and pepperoni, ginger ale, and 2 vanilla ice cream cups. He ate quietly, no signs of nerves or emotion. When asked if he wanted to make a final statement, he shook his head. His only words were, "I don't. I've said my goodbyes." And that was it. No apology, no plea, just silence. At 10:16 a.m., the lethal injection began. Within minutes, he was gone. For the family of Layla Cummings, it was the end of a 40-year fight for justice. Nothing could bring her back, but at least the long chapter of appeals and uncertainty had closed. Layla's name remains etched in memory, a reminder of innocence stolen and the devastating ripple one man's cruelty can cause. Richard Rojam Jr.'s execution was one of the most recent in Oklahoma, and it stood as proof of how long justice can take to be carried out. But where Rojam ended with quiet detachment, the next man met his fate with defiance. His last words, a chillingly casual brush-off that still echoes in the death chamber. Michael Duane Smith, the double murderer. It was February 2002 in Oklahoma City, and Michael Duane Smith was just 19 years old when his actions left 2 families shattered forever. Smith gunned down a man he believed had snitched on him to police, and hours later, he shot and killed a woman who was simply in the wrong place at the wrong time. 2 lives lost in the span of one night. 2 acts of violence that prosecutors would later describe as both cold and senseless. Smith's arrest came quickly. Witnesses placed him at the scenes, and his own words tied him to the crimes. In court, the details painted a stark picture of a young man who chose violence as a way to settle scores and prove himself. The jurors didn't hesitate. They convicted him on 2 counts of first-degree murder. By the time he was sentenced to death, Smith was barely past his teenage years. For more than 2 decades, his case wound through Oklahoma's legal system. His attorneys raised issues of mental illness, argued about his age at the time of the crimes, and tried to have the death sentence overturned. But the appeals failed. For the victims' families, each hearing meant reopening wounds that had never really closed. On April 4th, 2024, at the Oklahoma State Penitentiary in McAlester, Smith's final day arrived. Unlike many before him, he didn't request or receive a publicly noted last meal. Witnesses said he appeared calm as he was led into the execution chamber. When asked if he had any final words, he kept it brief. His only response? "Nah, I'm good." The injection began at 10:15 a.m. Within minutes, Smith was pronounced dead. The families of his victims sat quietly, absorbing the moment. Some felt closure, others only emptiness. What united them was the fact that 2 lives had been taken decades earlier, and no punishment could ever restore what was lost. Michael Duane Smith's execution underscored a painful truth. Even the young can leave behind devastating trails of violence, and justice, when it comes, is often long delayed. But Smith's defiant final words stand in stark contrast to the next man's ending. A prisoner who faced the gurney with claims of innocence, insisting to his very last breath that the state was about to execute the wrong man. Bigler Stauffer, the school teacher's murderer. In January 1985, the quiet Oklahoma community of Quail Creek was shaken by a crime that seemed almost impossible to understand. A school teacher named Linda Reeves was found dead, and suspicion quickly fell on a man named Bigler Job Stauffer II. Investigators pieced together what happened. Stauffer had targeted Reeves in an attempt to eliminate a romantic rival, and in doing so, he took the life of an innocent woman whose only mistake was being caught in the crossfire of his jealousy. The trial that followed revealed a man who had plotted carefully, but left behind a trail of evidence too strong to deny. Witness testimony, forensic details, and Stauffer's own tangled explanations sealed his fate. The jury convicted him of murder and sentenced him to death. For the family of Linda Reeves, it was a small measure of justice for the sudden loss of a woman remembered as kind, patient, and deeply loved by her students. But Stauffer's case would become one of the most debated in Oklahoma's recent history. For decades, he maintained his innocence, insisting that he had been framed. Appeals stretched on for years, with his lawyers arguing that mistakes had been made at trial and that the state was preparing to execute the wrong man. His case became a rallying point for some activists opposed to the death penalty, while for others, it was simply a matter of carrying out justice that had been delayed far too long. On December 9, 2021, after 36 years of legal battles, the state moved forward with the execution. Stufer's last meal was modest: chicken burger, chips, broccoli, fruit, biscuits, and a drink. Witnesses said he ate quietly, showing little outward emotion. When asked for a final statement, he repeated the claim he had made for decades, that he was innocent of Linda Reeves's murder. He added that he forgave those who were carrying out the sentence and prayed for God's mercy. "I'm at peace," he said. At 10:16 a.m., the lethal injection began. Within minutes, Stauffer was pronounced dead. Some family members of the victim expressed relief that the case had finally closed, though questions lingered for others about the long years of appeals and his steadfast denials. Bigler Stufer's story remains one of the most controversial in Oklahoma's death chamber. An execution shadowed by doubt, yet carried out in the name of justice for a beloved schoolteacher whose life was stolen decades earlier. And with Stufer's death, Oklahoma closed another chapter in its long history of executions. But the echoes of these 9 stories remain, each one a reminder of lives taken, justice sought, and the haunting final words that linger long after the prison doors close.